Well, it's like a bad memory. The U.S. can't seem to look past 5 Cuban men convicted on charges of espionage more than 10 years ago and locked up may have actually been victims of a smear campaign by the government. The National Committee to Free the Cuban Five is holding a press conference today. They claim to have evidence proving the U.S. paid tens of thousands of dollars to Miami journalists to spin stories against the 5 men to convince the jury to convict them. The men were arrested in 1996. They claim to be monitoring terrorist groups in Miami as a service to the Cuban government and say the FBI knew of their plans. This press conference brings criticism and questions over what President Obama will do to patch relations with the island nation. Is his stance any different than the last 3 administrations? Well, Gloria La Riva is a former U.S. presidential candidate and one of the main proponents for the release of the Cuban Five, and she joins me now. Thanks so much for being here. So first of all, I want you to give us a little bit more background on who these men are and what exactly happened to them, if you could.
Yes, Priya. Well, the Cuban Five are 5 men who came into Miami in the early 1990s in order to infiltrate the terrorist right-wing organizations in Miami that had been financed and armed by the United States government. The Cuban Five's mission was to report on those attacks, to prevent terrorism, to protect their island and the people of their country. And instead, the FBI arrested the Cuban Five in 1998. They were really persecuted in the courts and in the public by this. Now we find many journalists who were paid by the U.S. government secretly while they were covering the case of the 5. They were convicted in 2001 and sentenced to very lengthy terms from 15 years to double life.
And I know that today you guys held a press conference and you have proof or more evidence or information that the government was kind of paying these journalists to perhaps sway public opinion down there. Tell us a little bit more about what that new information or evidence is.
Well, the National Committee to Free the Cuban Five began a Freedom of Information Act research 18 months ago, and out of a relatively small list of names that we submitted, 14 names came back of journalists who it turns out were receiving covertly monies from the U.S. government, that is through the Agency of Radio and TV Marti and the managing entity, the Office of Cuba Broadcasting and the Broadcasting Board of Governors. It is illegal by U.S. law for these propaganda transmitters to be conveying U.S. propaganda within the U.S. borders. But the fact that they were paying U.S. journalists who pose as independent and yet were transmitting the same kind of information into Miami means that the population, the people of Miami, were subjected to months and months of propaganda against the Cuban Five.
And you know, last year the Supreme Court refused to review this case. Are you hoping that now with this new information from your FOIA request things will be different? What are you hoping for?
Well, the revelation of paid journalists while they were covering the case of the 5 and with very prejudicial articles, very biased and many false, requires the government to reverse the convictions, we believe. And so we've begun a campaign today calling on Eric Holder to immediately move to remedy the situation. And the only remedy can be the freeing of the Cuban Five and allow them to go home. And by the way, we should keep in mind that their mission was saving lives. They never had a weapon. They never harmed anyone. They saved lives. And yet, a terrorist like Luis Posada Carriles, who is known to have bombed a Cuban airliner, a terrorist, one of those terrorists, lives freely in Miami, even though he entered the U.S. 5 years ago illegally. He walks the streets a free man, while the Cuban Five anti-terrorists are in U.S. prison. So Miami is an extremely unique city. It is the base of operations of quite a number of terrorist organizations who have operated with impunity. And unfortunately, the Obama administration is allowing this to continue.
And, you know, I want to ask you about the UN Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International did find that, in fact, this was an unfair trial. How has it been that, you know, the United States can simply ignore those 2 organizations and what they have found? I mean, well, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, the U.S. government violates and flaunts international law. And so it will have to be the court of millions of people in the world who know about the case of the Cuban Five, the Cuban people first, and those of us in the U.S. and other countries who know that the men are truly heroes and should be freed. And the other is It really boils down to the right of Cuba to its self-defense. Cuba had appealed to the U.S. government continually to cooperate in fighting this terrorism, to work together, and instead the FBI arrested the Cuban Five in 1998. Now, the revelation of this secretly paid journalism in Miami just adds more to this evidence of ours that Miami was the last place they should have been tried. In fact, they never should have been arrested. So the website, freethefive.org, five is spelled out, freethefive.org has all that information. And we have a lawsuit currently against the U.S. government. They're trying to hold on to more evidence of this paid journalism. We have a second Freedom of Information Act pending.
And President Obama has said repeatedly that he wants to normalize ties with Cuba. Wouldn't this kind of be an obvious gesture to at least reinvestigate this case? I mean, why don't you think he has done that if he keeps, saying that he wants that?
Well, the first step should be to free the men, but in fact, Obama has said that he will maintain the blockade, and the greatest violation of human rights against the Cuban people is the 50-year-long blockade which denies them food, medicine, and tries to basically strangle the island. I don't think very much really has changed with the Obama administration following the Bush policies.
Well, Gloria, thanks so much for your time, and we'll continue to follow this story and update our viewers.
Thank you.